Thank you. I see he's given me 10 and a half minutes. Thank you, Ronnie. Just briefly, this is not the most popular job at the moment, as I'm sure my colleagues from the other parts of the world. You know, when you're the most sort of unseen person in the city when everything's going well. But when things go wrong, suddenly you know, persona non grata. So it's been fun, I have to say, and it has been stressful. And I thought just to raise the stress level this morning before I give this talk, I had to do a little trick on myself. I was in the office quite early to deal with a few issues before coming here, but I got here nice and early, just before 7:30. Walked in, well, started to get out my car and realized I'd left my bag with the computer in my office. So I had to drive back into the city through the traffic and still get back here in time. So no stresses. I'm going to take you briefly through the story behind how we led up to where we are at the moment. Just quickly get myself organized here. Okay, this is right. The city of Cape Town feeds off the Western Cape system of dams, which is quite a complex system, all in all, and it's essentially managed by the National Department of Water and Sanitation. And we've got 6 dams in that system. The city has 3 of them, which it's built over time, together with a lot of other very much smaller dams, but the 6 main ones are the ones that I'm talking about. And the National Department built the last 3, which are the largest. And we, as the city, have a bulk infrastructure system that enables us to maximize the yield of that system of dams by changing loading on them, by putting more load through a treatment works from feeding from a dam when we see, for argument's sake, that dam is rising faster during winter, and we don't want spilling from that dam when the others are still, you know, below spilling point, ultimately getting maximum storage. The dams, as I don't have to go into detail for all of you, are influenced by demands, and the demands essentially are in our case, the urban, which is predominantly Cape Town, and then of course the small municipalities that we also supply with treated water, but then a few that are independent of the city supply and get direct raw water. And the uncertainty, of course, has been in the agricultural sector for a while, where there were high demands to agriculture. In recent times, that was managed and brought down. Now, I just want to give you context for this drought that we're in. We've had 3 successive years of very poor rainfall, and I think the slide above there indicates from an average rainfall of around about 550, but going up to 850 millimeters per annum. We're down to under 200 in this last of the 3 years of drought, which is really extreme. And putting all 3 together, it has a return period that's estimated at over 1 in 300. So it's an extreme drought that no water supply system can prepare for without going through extreme stress. Unfortunately, to try and explain this to firstly politicians and also lay people is very difficult. And that's where the problem option lies. Day zero was a term that we didn't necessarily invent. It was kind of picked up through the social media from the disaster management sector, I think. But we decided to define it and use it and say to people, when we needed to get a quick behavioral change, we'd driven demand down to a point and we'd hit a plateau and we couldn't get it lower. So we said, Cape Town, wake up. Day zero can be a reality. Looking at the little graph on the left-hand side there, the calculations done showed that we would intersect the 13.5% level in the system of dams, which we deemed to be a disaster in itself. It wouldn't mean that we were running out of water, but we would then cut off supply to the reticulation to the residential areas, and people would have to come and collect water from distribution points that we would set up for that. But we would maintain supply to key points, hospitals, etc. So projecting forward on consumption over the last 2 weeks, we would project that line down to where it would hit the 13.5%, and that was the date. And it was back in 22nd of January, that projected date for day zero was going to be the 12th of April. So what's happened since that? We got the necessary response. Unfortunately, the media and everybody else decided to take their own interpretation and say, day zero is going to happen, we're going to be without water. So there was mad panic. In that first week, instead of consumption going down, it went up because people started to hoard water. And of course, the shops saw this as an opportunity, and massive supply of what you've got in front of you, bottled water. By 10 o'clock, the Pick and Pays, all the big markets were sold out, gone, massive rush on it. And that went on for some time, but within a week, we saw the decline. And that pushed us down from the 600 megalitres a day down to the 500 over a period of about a week and a half to 2 weeks. It wasn't the intention to panic people. It was to say to them, look, this can happen. So if you do this, it won't happen. But eventually it worked. So now, looking at the graph on the right-hand side, you can see the projected, well, you can see the actual line. In the one on the left-hand side, there's a pointer here. That's the projected line going forward, the actual in the dark. On this side, we show you the actual that has taken place. Now, you can see that the inflection point which kicked that graph out of the yellow zone, which was deemed to be, we could manage it. The red zone would be supercritical, and we'd have to move to special actions that we'd set up. But now that we're well above that, and what happened? Well, firstly, we drove the demand down in the urban area, but secondly, agriculture was capped off at their limit of their supply for the year. So that also had a big impact. So the drawdown on the dams, which typically last year at that time was 1.4% per week, we're now sitting at, well, up until a few weeks ago, we were sitting at about 0.5% per week. So hence the flattening of that curve. Right now we had a little bit, you can see the kink there, we had a little bit of rainfall, which obviously helped the situation and actually raised the dams unexpectedly, on my part anyway, by about 0.9%. We're seeing a little bit now, which will also have a small impact. But all of this, as long as you have reasonably short periods between these rainfall events, we will start getting some significant runoff taking place. So what have we done to manage this drought situation? Obviously, demand management, we know, is the most key way to deal with the drought. You cannot build your way out of a drought, and I'm sure everybody here understands that the size of the infrastructure that you need to get the volumes that are necessary to get out of a drought situation cannot be built in a short term. So the big focus is on the demand management, and I've listed the things there under each of those groups as to what we've done, and I'll go through some of them in more detail as I move forward. Big thing is, of course, communication, having a consistent and sensible communication that the public can understand. Now, that's often compromised by, let's say, the political side of things, and the story gets a little distorted, and particularly if you've got some opposing views politically as well. So it becomes very difficult to manage then. System integrity is obviously very important to maintain. And we chose to go for a very aggressive approach to pressure management. I made a decision early on, and I convinced everybody that going to intermittent supply was the worst thing possible to do for Cape Town. We have a massive 11,000 kilometer network in our mains, and a lot of it is quite old, although we've got quite an advanced program on replacement. The risk, exactly as was shown earlier, was just too high. So we've managed to avoid that. Putting in devices to regulate flow right at the usage point on the houses was also something that we stepped up. We had been doing it as part of a debt management plan to restrict people that were not paying down into their free allocation of water, which City used to give to everybody, and now only to the indigent folk. So we expanded that to also hit the delinquent users, as I call them, the people that just refuse to bring their demand down and continue to use high usage. And then we embarked on a lot of household and business adaptation planning and discussions and getting an integration with organizations as to how can they drive their demand down, how can we assist them in doing that. And of course, providing as much information as possible out there so that we can actually help in the behavioral change. In terms of managing the dams, it was critical that we had full control over what was going on, where the water was going, and doing this in conjunction with the national department was very important and key, I think, to where we've managed to get to now. Rainfall, I don't know what we say about rainfall except that you pray. The agricultural releases was critical to ensure that, and there has been some, let's call it theft of water, as the water is released down the rivers from the dams. And of course, careful modeling, which I'll talk about. Then, of course, the new water, getting the additional supply. Now, we've had a planning scenario together with the National Department over many years, and it was always seen that we would need to respond to this threat of climate change. And our program had been set up to introduce the alternatives of groundwater, reuse, and desalination. In that order, given the reasoning in terms of cost of the unit costs. But we had to accelerate those plans rapidly to meet the crisis that we're in now. So let me just quickly show you the difference there. The top one is unrestricted before the effects of the drought was recognized and we started driving the demand down. Blue is agriculture, and you can see that's seasonal. The green band is the urban use, and you can see peaking in the summer around about 1,200 megaliters a day. And the evaporation rate was the orange little band at the bottom, also seasonal here with the hot summers, hot and windy. And down below is what we experience now more recently. And we virtually halved the demand, certainly in the urban, and the agricultural side has been cut. National Department restricted agriculture by 60% and the urban sector by 45%. And they were capped, and no more releases were made once they hit that cap on the agricultural side. And we are very close to meeting the 45% as well. We're currently exceeding it by a small margin, but we believe by the end of the hydrological cycle, the hydrological year, we will have met the restriction level. Now that just shows over the last 5 years that the yellow one at the top is 2014, then the dark blue one is 2015, the light 16, and then last year is the green one. Now you can see where we started the year, last year, at about 45% of the dam levels. This year we started at 31%. Yet we're only now, and this is last week's graph, I haven't updated it, we're now this week on Monday, we're only 1.5% lower in the dam level than we were last year at the same time. So you can see how that curve is flattened in terms of driving the demand down. And that has been quite remarkable, and I have to say an enormous thank you to my team that have worked so tirelessly to achieve this sort of thing. But it's been a concerted effort for a number of parties. This is just the modeling going forward, and it's just to illustrate the total uncertainty of the situation. The green line, which is showing, this is a 2-year cycle, green line essentially shows going forward, if we meet the restriction levels that have been imposed, which we currently are, and agriculture stays within the restricted levels as well, and we have essentially similar rainfall to last year. Now remember last year what I showed you was an extremely low rainfall, and the chances of it being as low as that are very, very small, but unfortunately not impossible. So, but let's look at the green line, and that takes us through with a certain amount of augmentation that we know we can build before the end of next summer, and we make it through by avoiding the dreaded day zero. If we look at the red line, that is if we, which one was that now? That was going to 600. In other words, we didn't stay at the restricted level. We went to 600 megaliters a day. You can see we hit day zero by about the beginning of April next year. The little thin light brown one just above that is if we are on, yeah, we're on the restriction level, but we only get 75% of last year's rainfall. It's also pretty bad. So you can see the variations there, but probabilistically speaking, we should be able to get through it. And I'll talk about accessing the lower levels of the dam below 13.5%. But of course, if we just happen to have average rainfall, the dams would lift to 75 to 80%, which just shows you just how sensitive this whole thing is to getting reasonable rainfall. On the other hand, if we get half of the rainfall that we got last year, that's what it would look like, and we'd hit day zero very early on in next year. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty yet, and it's very dependent on what happens this winter. So demand management, as I've mentioned, has been absolutely critical. We've driven the restriction levels all the way up to 6B now as it is. And the B comes into it as a result of us being, it's to do with bringing new tariffs in at a more punitive rate. In terms of the local regulations or Municipal Finance Management Act, you cannot change tariffs mid-year without having them approved as part of the budget process. And we've always approved 4 sets of tariffs at every budget process so that we had them available to jump to depending on what level of restriction we might have to be in. However, we never anticipated going to a level 6. So once we went from 4 up to 5 and then 6, we were actually making a huge loss. This year we're about 1.7 billion rand down on revenue. Now, how do you deal with that? We tried to get a drought charge approved by the politicians, which would be imposed on everybody like a sort of a levy each month to help recover what people were paying a lot less for their water, right? They were getting a lot less water, but they were still getting the service. But we have to maintain the service, and the cost of the variable cost is a minute portion. It's mainly fixed charges, I'm sure you understand. So that was a major battle as well. So when we've now managed to get permission from the National Finance Minister, and we could impose a new set of tariffs, and they came in from February this year. And that has also obviously contributed because, and I'll show you them just now, they are quite punitive. And the new tariffs that will come in July, because of the fact that we're driving everybody down to 50 litres per person per day, means an average household usage of 4 people of 6 kilolitres per month, which is essentially 200 litres per household per day. Now, the adaptation processes where we've kind of encouraged and in some ways forced businesses to drop their demand, that has worked extremely well as well. We've got huge response, and obviously it's driven by money. Businesses have found ways to recycle water and do that. We've pushed our treated effluent supply. We return about 9.5% currently of water. All water that goes through our water treatment plants goes through the system, through the wastewater plants, and then gets returned back after a little bit of extra treatment, back to industry, back to, for instance, golf courses and recreational facilities, and to some agriculture for use as non-potable water. So we've encouraged that into the construction industry and other industries as well, made more points available for people to come and collect. And that has also taken a lot of load off. Now here you can see the graph in the middle is showing over the last few years how the demand, and that is actually water supply. That's a mini graph of every day supply. You can see the daily fluctuations there, but over the years you can see the cycle as we've imposed stronger and stronger restrictions, how we've driven the demand down. And effectively now we're saving 400 megalitres a day over what we were similar time in recent history. And that's essentially through this aggressive pressure management, the punitive tariffs, and of course all the various other demand management devices that we've got in the system. I won't go into too much detail there because I'm running down, but we've improved the efficiencies in the system, and I'll talk a little bit more about the demand management, the pressure management in a sec. But just to note that the non-revenue water is at the moment 24. We were just nudging under 20 before all of the drought effects started to take impact and our demand started dropping down and down. And knowing how you determine non-revenue water, the denominator does have an impact. And right now that we're down at half of the flow that we would normally, unfortunately, the percentage has gone up. But the national average is around 41%. So we tend to try and compare ourselves with international best practice. And in terms of actual losses, we're around about 16%. We were around about the 14% before these last few years impacted it. We've looked at how we can be more efficient in dealing with bursts. We get an average about 850 call-outs a day. And what we did was to streamline the reaction time so that we could get out quicker, was to start what we call first-line response, or multi-line response. Initially, the call comes in through the call center, it goes to dispatch, they send off just a simple bucky with two guys in with minimal equipment. They'll go out, identify the problem, leak, burst, isolate it, and if it's a small thing, they'll fix it. If not, they'll call in the appropriate size resource to come. Now that's improved both the cost efficiency and obviously time and response efficiency considerably as well. And then mains replacement. That graph is actually indicating how we've brought down the burst mains. The broken line, the dotted line at the top, is the bursts per 100 kilometers per annum. We were sitting there in about the 2010 mark at about 66, so we're down to about 30 at the moment, bursts per 100 kilometers per annum, through the mains replacement programs and also pressure management in bringing down pressure. And of course, the number of bursts per year is indicated in the solid line. So what have we done with demand management? We initiated the implementation and aggressive implementation of a demand management and conservation strategy from the early part of this century, and we've built it up. And I'll show a graph just now to show the trend prior to the turn of the century in demand for Cape Town, and how we've turned that and flattened it essentially over the last 15 years, or longer in fact. And that has cost us, and projected through to 2020, to be about 3.2 billion rand in terms of managing this demand. Now what it's done is, whilst we've driven the demand down and driven these efficiencies, it's made it so much more difficult for us to squeeze out that further amount of saving when we hit the crisis now, because there was already a huge amount of water efficiency that had been built into Cape Town. You can see the graph on the bottom left-hand corner is showing the water losses and the non-revenue water in blue. And we adopt the IWA's system for managing the non-revenue water. That's the curve. Now that's the annual average daily demand that's represented there in blue that's only taking it from 1950, but typically as we reach the end of the last century, we were around about 4.5% per annum demand growth. And we realized we couldn't just keep on supplying that. We needed to change how Cape Town worked with water. So we needed to start managing the demand, and hence you can see how we flattened that curve for 15, 16 years. There was an upturn just before this drought hit. And then, of course, where the star is currently where we are. And that's indicating actual consumption treated in terms of million cubic meters per annum. So we're under 200 now. And that's about the same as the period in about the late 1980s, early 1990s. So we've gone back currently to the demands, but meanwhile the population of Cape Town has more than doubled in that time. And this also just shows the consumption per person averaged across the city over the period. I unfortunately haven't updated this for all the other metros in South Africa. The black line is the average for South Africa. And I'm just wanting to get the data to progress that all the way through to current time. But the green broken line is Cape Town's per capita consumption, how that's been driven down. And I think you can see the figures there. Now also importantly is this is the actual allocation of water from the National Department. And the light blue band at the bottom was all the resources available to us up until the last dam which was built, which was the Berg River Dam, which was filled for the first time, I think, late 2007. And we've only just nudged into using water from that allocation before the drought hit, and we've had to drive the demand down. So in terms of actual allocation and legal use of water, we're well within that. The portion at the top, above the blue, the dark blue, which is the Berg River allocation, which incidentally the city funded to provide as an additional insurance against problems going forward. But dams don't help much if there hasn't been any rain to fill them. So the top band there is showing what we plan going forward for use of alternative water. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm almost finished, Ronnie. I'd like to just home in on the pressure management, because at the start of this year, or at the end of last year, we pulled together some of the key operators in the field of pressure management, and we got on board two of the best companies in the country, and we said, look guys, roll up your sleeves, we really need your help here. We've got to take this by the scruff of the neck and drive our demand down further. And we have to squeeze the last drop out of this stone through pressure management and aggressively. And that's what they did. So they put a plan together, presented it to us, and we said, go for it. And it was funded, obviously. And and Pierre Maritz, one of my managers sitting over there, we tasked him specifically to coordinate and use our demand management teams and use our reticulation guys collectively together with this team of consultants that have come in, and we've squeezed that out. And the little graph on the left-hand side shows the planned saving in terms of megaliters per day, and what they actually managed to achieve was the red line, and that is from January, the beginning of this year. Currently, we're over 50 megaliters a day that has been accumulated in savings per day as a result of that aggressive action taken from the start of this year. So that has added hugely to us being able to get the demand down. And you can see the main graph there showing the daily demand, and then the red bands are showing the actual savings associated with this exercise. That's just a little bit of stats. I won't go into the detail. The other part of the exercise was to look at leakage detection. So through this exercise, since that started, they've done over 4,000 Ks of retic testing and found significant leaks, and we've repaired those as well. The other aspect of it, which was interesting in terms of the analysis of the leakage, was that a lot of the leakage, 90% of it, was seen to be coming not from the mains, but in fact from the connections, or on the inside of the connections. In other words, in households where people were taking water, but it was because of the night flows, there were leaks clearly in the house. So now we're about to go into private properties and start fixing leaks in there as well. And it's predominantly in the indigent areas where they are getting free water, so there's not a big incentive there for them to fix leaks. Although we do have the devices on, a large proportion. We've been putting these water management devices on. There's about 260,000 of them in our system of 650,000 metered connections that Cape Town has. So we've been accelerating that over the last months as well. So the other part of the equation is adding new water in. And we've started off that program driven predominantly by the politicians reacting and say, don't worry, Cape Town, we've got this, we're going to build our way out of it, which unfortunately was a bad message to tell the people, because it took the pressure off, well, let's not use the word pressure, took the focus off driving household demand down, because people thought, okay, well, you know, we're going to be building enough. Unfortunately, the reality struck, and once it was realized that certain volumes couldn't be achieved, and desalination wasn't going to be the solution, because short-term desalination just proved to be way too expensive, and it was also shown that, well, we'd researched it as well, but it was certainly shown to us by some experts that we pulled in from overseas to advise us that you never get what is promised. And it's easy, just switch it off. You never get what's promised. Maybe with all good intentions, those contractors may believe when they're tendering that they can do it, but it always ends up costing more and always much later than it is intended to be delivered. So learning from that, we've moved away from temporary desal, moved away from temporary reuse schemes, and rather focusing on permanent installations to realize those volumes, obviously at a later stage, but to build our resilience going forward. And the focus has been now on driving the use of groundwater. And that is where we will realize significant volumes in a much shorter term and at a far reduced cost. Reuse is something that was always part of the program, and that is being built in as well. And we'll have our first 10 megaliter a day of reuse coming into the system in a few months' time. But that's been expanded over the going forward. And we're looking at about, very roughly speaking, a mix of reuse, desal, and groundwater, which I'll show you the proportions of a little bit later on. But just to talk about groundwater, the focus has been in the Atlantis area, where we currently already have an artificially recharged aquifer system, so we'll be expanding on that. In the Cape Flats aquifer, which is a very large aquifer system, primary aquifer, extensive drilling is being done there, and that will start to produce water into the system within the next month or two as well. Then the very deep fractured rock aquifer, what's termed the Table Mountain group of aquifers, underlying the Cape Folded Mountain Belt, and this is a massive extended aquifer system running from Van Reinsdorp, I believe, to Port Elizabeth. And we've been exploring that for many years now and identified good places. So we focused on areas closest to our current infrastructure to drill those. But that's very deep drilling, but it will yield very good water and a very reliable source of water as well. And then the temporary desals that we'd already pulled the trigger on before turning it around, they are in fact already producing water, and they're in commissioning stage, just confirming quality sufficient to feed into the system. One at the waterfront and two along the False Bay coastline at Monroe, BC and Strandfontein. So they will be feeding into the system at any day now. And this is our build program as we have it right now. I won't go into the detail, but those are the various components of additional water that we've managed to transfer from other schemes across the watershed, which we've managed to get agreement with through the National Department and with the Water User Association. That's the first tall bar on the left-hand side. And then groundwater, current springs that we're developing within the city, and then all the other various augmentation portions. Now, I just want to show you what it looked like at the beginning of the year. And as one learns more and starts refining what one can do, you can see the superimposed line that runs through that set of bars is in fact where we are now. So it always looks a lot more rosy until you really understand and get down to grips with it. So augmentation is never going to be the savior, but it has to be there, and we realize that we need to build it in for resilience going forward. These graphs are really just showing comparatives in terms of time for delivery and unit costs and uncertainties in them. On the right-hand side, surface water, clearly the cheapest, groundwater, coming in at a bit more than that with limited uncertainty and cost, then reuse, and then, of course, desalination on the far right-hand side. And we use those criteria to assist us in planning forward. Now, of course, income, and I mentioned it earlier, one needs to take into account that you've driven the demand down. So now your source of revenue is compromised. And tariffs were intended to be adjusted progressively as your restriction levels came in, but I explained earlier where we hit a problem. We've now corrected that currently under a lot of pressure from the public, obviously. But going forward, I won't go into this detail, but those are the current tariffs at the moment. So if you're using between 0 and 6 kiloliters, you're paying 26.25 Rand per kiloliter. If you between the 6 and the 10.5, you're 46. But as soon as you start migrating up into the higher, where we don't want you to be, you pay up to 800 Rand a kiloliter. Now, that's quite a significant punitive tariff. But if we're now selling effectively half of what we used to sell, it means we're going to have to put the tariff up to double in order to maintain the revenue stream. So that's effectively what we've had to do. But now, because we're driving people down into the bottom band, our next tariff adjustment coming in July means that we've got to try and get all of our revenue from that bottom band while we are still in 6B and 5 restriction level. Now, doing these tariffs is not an easy task, and determining them. There's some information there, if you guys get a copy of this, showing where we will be. But we've also restructured the tariff to try and provide some resilience going forward. And putting a portion of the tariff will be a fixed charge, and it'll be in proportion to the size of your connection. There'll be a fixed charge. That's the table on the bottom right-hand corner there. So you get a fixed monthly charge, depending on your connection size. Then your tariff, obviously slightly reduced per kiloliter used within the bottom band, up to about 10.5, is essentially driven by the average cost. Once we go up to the higher level, it's the marginal rate of additional demand-driven augmentation costs that then drive those bands of the tariff. So in summary, the main points that we realized that were key was to have an aggressive demand management strategy in order to control the fall in the dams. And I've mentioned the various ones, and key to it has been pressure management. But the most important impact, I believe, that has taken place is the behavioral change that the population of Cape Town has managed to achieve. And it has taken a lot of work, a lot of interaction with the public, messaging, workshops, conferences, but it's been an amazing turnaround. Initially, there was a poor response. There was a lot of finger-pointing, blaming. You were told that this was going to happen. Why didn't you plan? You know, I'm sure you've all heard of these across the world as well. But at the end of the day, when we pointed out the facts of the matter, and we said, come on, guys, let's pull together on this thing, and suddenly the mood changed, and people started saying, and I could hear them on the radio saying, it's no good pointing fingers because that's not going to get us more water. Let's all work this out together. How can we save water amongst ourselves? And there was a lot more citizenry activity taking place, and this is what we were also motivating from our side as well. Careful control over how the water is actually used, and then fast-tracking augmentation where it's possible within reason, focusing on long-term implementation of the raw and the reuse, the desalination and reuse, moving away from temporary high costs, and then accelerating all groundwater as much as possible. Of course, the tariffs, very important. Got to use that as a driver as well. And then showing good, strong, consistent, and honest leadership, I think, is essential through this, and getting good communication and buy-in from your public. So Pierre actually took this picture of Tim yesterday. So it was interesting just to compare how we've done against what he believes the 10 points. And I think largely we've covered most of them through perhaps good luck, because I hadn't seen your presentation before. But I have to thank Cape Town, the people, and certainly my team for where we've managed to get to now. We're not out of the woods, but although our dams are 1.5% lower than we were at this time last year, I feel more confident that we have a better chance of getting through another bad year if we have another bad winter, because we know what we can achieve now. And there's systems in place to manage it far better than they were last year at this time. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I think everyone that is interested in Cape Town and what's happening with the water will be having a sigh of relief just for a little while. So I think at least we can shower and bath, etc. Well, not bath, but certainly use some water. Thanks very much for that. We do have one other